Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. We're really excited for this event. It was originally scheduled in March, and we were able to get Dr. Casey back up here now in this month. So I am Sarah Moezides. I'm a dual master's student at Harvard Divinity School and at the Fletcher School, a first-year Malt. And it's a pleasure and an honor to open up this event today on behalf of the Religion, Law, and Diplomacy Club, as well as a big thank you to our sponsors, Center for Strategic Studies, International Security Studies Program, and Tufts Global Month events, which would have been in March. But anyways, I am going to kick it off with some intros. Chris Melvin is one of the military fellows here at Fletcher and will be moderating today. He was enlisted in the USAF and served from 1990 to 1994 in aircraft armament, graduated in 1997 with the Bachelor of Arts in Pastoral Studies and a Master of Arts in Biblical Studies, and then rejoined the military, enlisting in the Arizona Army National Guard since 2002, accessing as a chaplain in 2006, and had 2 combat deployments, both to Afghanistan in 2007 and to the Horn of Africa, Djibouti in 2017. He currently serves as the Senior State Army Chaplain for the Arizona National Guard. And Dr. Shaun Casey, first and foremost, is a professor of mine that I finally am meeting now because our class was remote last year at Harvard Divinity. But Shaun Casey was special representative for Religion and Global Affairs at the U.S. Department of State and director of the Office of Religion and Global Affairs from 2013 to 2017. He has taught at Harvard Divinity School, Wesley Theological Seminary, and the Walsh School of Foreign Service, and directed the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. We are very excited to have this talk, and we will have Q&A open up once some moderated questions by Chris begin.
Are you going to do this? Yes. Well, welcome, everybody. Want to say thank you to Dr. Casey for coming. We have some folks on Zoom around the country. So is anybody capturing questions when it comes time to get the questions? Okay. Thank you, Kate. Some of you may have seen Dr. Casey's interview with Mike McCurry, President Clinton's former chief of staff, at the Foggy Bottom bookstore. So I would like to come off of that. One of the things I heard was how you got to this position with the Office of Religion and Global Affairs at the State Department. But if you'd be willing to just detail how you got to this position, what's driven you, what's pulled you, kind of what's inside you that's wired you for this and what you've enjoyed about it.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Sarah. Let me just say, first of all, it's great to be here. Tufts has a very special place in my family story. My wife is a graduate of the college here. I actually asked her to marry me on this campus 40 some odd years ago. So she couldn't be with me here today, but I'm going to try to find that spot before I head back home. But if anybody ever says Tufts is not a romantic place, send them to me, and I'll straighten them out as quickly as I can. I have a very checkered, zigzaggy career. So my first piece of career advice is don't be like Shaun, because I didn't have a goal, I didn't have a path. And I actually have an entire chapter of the book really talking about my peculiar upbringing and background. It was kind of a very miraculous thing that I ended up on the 7th floor of the State Department working for John Kerry, the then Secretary of State. But basically, I grew up in a family where religion and politics were conversations at the dinner table from the get-go. I also became a newspaper boy at the age of 11. And so every morning in this tiny one-horse town in Western Kentucky, where I grew up, and you can still hear a little bit of the tragic accent I grew up with, I read the newspaper of the Louisville Courier-Journal every morning by like 5:10 in the morning. And you start that at 11, you begin to see that the world's a very big place. And this was at the height of the Vietnam War. So there was always a story about foreign policy on the front page of the newspaper, which I carried for 3 or 4 years there. So I just grew up, despite the fact I grew up in this sort of very small town, lower middle class environment. The other twin emphasis where I grew up was getting as good an education as you could. And I grew up, I come from a family of teachers, all 7 of us, both parents, all 5 kids at one point or another have taught. Either in public schools or at the university level. So I had this thirst for knowledge, and even though we were living in this very out of the way place, I saw very quickly it was a big world. And what was going on in that world was literally shaping the environment where I grew up. And from an early age, I realized the United States was just simply one country in this very, very complex planet we were living on. And I finished my doctorate at Harvard Divinity School, and I took a job teaching religion and politics in Washington, D.C. And so I literally got the perfect academic position to be observing what was going on. But then I met John Kerry fairly early in my career there. And one thing led to another, and we sort of developed this odd couple relationship where, even though we come from 2 very different symbolic universes, we shared a sense that American diplomacy had missed many, many opportunities because of its willful ignorance of religious dynamics. And I have an entire chapter in the book talking about how Iraq is sort of the big case that shows how not even before we invaded to then after we occupied and then the insurgency started and we tried to do post-conflict reconstruction, our willful ignorance of those religious dynamics just led to cascading disasters for the next 2 decades. And so part of my thesis was Iraq is a casebook study of how not to do religious dynamics. And it was a willful ignorance. It wasn't that they just happened to tiptoe by religion and they missed it. It's because they said, we don't do religion. And I resolved to the extent that my academic work might have an influence on that, sort of be the lone guy in the corner. Now, I wasn't by myself. There were lots of people in Washington to that point crying out that they were making terrible, terrible mistakes because of their inability to interpret the rich and complicated religious dynamics of Iraq. So in many ways, there's that old adage about President Bush, he was born on third base and he thought he grew up hitting a triple. I sort of, in a sense, was born on third base, given the educational opportunities I had and the cultural upbringing that I had, and then to be introduced to John Kerry in 2005, all the pieces were there. So that when he became Secretary of State and wanted to start an office of religious analysis, he turned to me and asked me to come in.
I wanted to, something that popped up as you were sharing that is certainly we're talking from a US centric perspective, State Department, were there places we were getting it done well prior to, or was it fits and spurts?
Oh my, that's a great question. Not really. I mean, it's interesting. I off the top of my head, I cannot say. Now, we have had an ambassador to the Vatican since, I think, 1984. But that relationship has always gone up and down, and tended to be ceremonial, where, there's a term that's used in Washington called collars for cameras, where many times politicians, when they're debuting a particular public policy position, they have an arm around the cardinals doing the selfie or something, is like great for PR. And I think the American government has also often looked at religious leaders as props, that if an imam or if an archbishop can be seen as endorsing American policy, we would use them for that. But to the extent we thought they had any good ideas about foreign policy, even in their own arena, that just has not been part of the culture at the State Department. I think it's driven in many parts by American exceptionalism. We're obviously smarter, better, and than anybody else in the world. And it's just that the rest of the world would wake up one day and acknowledge that, then it would be a really cool place. And that's led to disasters. So I can't really think of a place. Now, I'll probably on the drive home, I'll think of 1 or 2 places. But historically, you look at American diplomacy in Vietnam, I think we were blind to the Buddhist and to the Catholic dynamics there because the French had messed it up. So we can't trust people who had been allied with the French there. So it's kind of a tragic tale. Now, having said that, you will find occasionally the off-career ambassador who has had a lived experience, but they can only have an imprint kind of within the walls of their own embassy. And what really helped us become successful is when we would meet an ambassador who was a career foreign service officer who'd worked in different regions, and they recognized the history there. They knew the amazing things that religious communities sometimes did. They also knew some of the ambiguous things they did, and they also knew some of the less than perfect things they did. You would get an ambassador, and that's where we had an opportunity to go and to co-train with staff there when the ambassador would say, we really need to get smarter here about the religious dynamics. But they had not been professionally rewarded for that. It had been because of their own configuration of interests and their ability to interpret their host country to say, we need to get smarter on religion. They would then call us and bring us in. And that's what you really wanted, was a leader in an embassy or a consulate who knew what they didn't know. And they wanted to learn what the gaps were, and they would look to us and look to other people to get up to speed on the religious dynamics. And that was the perfect sort of a synergy that we were looking for around the world.
So no spots where this could have been birthed earlier, the work that was done during the Obama administration?
You know, that's a great question. I will kick myself, I'm sure. But no, I don't think, I can't think of any sustained efforts. Now, I guess the one exception I will say, we discovered in the embassy and in the embassy in Tel Aviv and the consulate in Jerusalem, there were staffers who I promptly stole when their 3-year rotation was up. I brought them into my office because they, I think particularly of a Foreign Service officer, Rachel Leslie, who ran public diplomacy for my shop. She helped run public diplomacy there on the West Bank. So she was in charge of engaging the complex religious groups in the West Bank and in Gaza. And she was my control officer the first time I visited. So she set up all my visits. And so here's a woman who's fluent in Hebrew and Arabic. And I think she did 3 tours in Jerusalem. I mean, she was just absolutely brilliant. She'd taken a year off and gone to the University of Chicago Divinity School and wrote a thesis. It was like, if the State Department ever got smart on religion, this is how they should do it. And she sent me her thesis after I met her the first time. So she, along with her colleagues there in the consulate, had realized that you don't understand civil society in Israel or in Palestine by saying we don't do religion. And so they had incorporated engaging religious actors into their work there. Now, when did that start? I don't know. But when I arrived in 2014, they were up and running, and they've been doing this for quite some time.
Okay. So it's nothing systemic that was a success that you saw.
That's right.
Okay. It's often been said you're not supposed to talk about religion and politics in polite company, but in effective company, maybe talking about religion and geopolitics.
It does make for some very short airplane conversations. What do you do? Oh, I do religion and politics. Oh, okay, thanks. You know, I get a lot of reading done.
One of the questions I'd like to ask is, how would you characterize the ebb and the flow of the discussion surrounding religion and global events as administrations change? In your book, you share a discussion with Senator Rubio's staff and the charge that came your way that the Religion and Global Affairs in the State Department was absorbing or replacing the IRF, and perhaps that I guess my question, could there be similar legislative ways to either recreate or instantiate something? What do you, that's kind of the long end of the question. And the short end is, how would you describe that ebb and flow, either since or just before?
So to put our office and work in the context, I think you can go back to the founding of the Republic, which I will spare you the long lecture. But in 2006, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright wrote a book called The Mighty and the Almighty that described her career And she, if you're familiar with the book, she talks about how she can pick up the phone and call historians, economists, just all kinds of experts, military experts, historical, diplomatic experts. But when it came to religion, there was nobody on the end of the phone. And even though religion cut across her portfolio there in the late 90s, the second Clinton administration. And so she's writing her first book after leaving the secretariat and sort of stunned the world that religion was the big issue for her, that had always been a historical gap in the State Department. And she explores kind of the historical reasons for that. Also after 9/11, as one friend of mine said, on 9/12, suddenly there were hundreds of self-appointed Islamic experts born in America who had read some websites and, read a couple of books maybe. And the US government realized it had no capacity, eventually realized it had no capacity to understand Islam. The intelligence community began to build some assets to understand global, again, these terms like the Islamic world are problematic, but they're sometimes a good shorthand. So after 9/11, a lot of people began to realize we didn't, as a government, as a foreign policy apparatus, have the institutional knowledge we should have. Now, some of the initiatives that came up in response to that were bad. Some of them were awful. Some of them were okay. But it took until the second Obama administration for this office, the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, to get started. And we can go into the details of why that happened or didn't happen. So you're right, it's been sort of a sine wave. And historically, in 1998, Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act, almost unanimously, if not unanimously, which set up this apparatus on religious freedom. And there are a lot of people, and there's a lot of money working in that sector, a lot of conservative Christians in particular, who sometimes feel like they own that space. I think the space is now expanded and it's less sectarian than it once was. But there are some very intense partisan dynamics in that wider sphere. And so some of them looked at our work as a threat to the religious freedom regime. I don't think that's true. Our mission was different from their mission, and we collaborated together. But over history, some of the conservative defenders of religious freedom don't want there to be any other diplomatic work done, and they think that's all there is in terms of diplomacy. And that's just historically not true. That's not sufficient to say the religious freedom dynamics are the only political dynamics that make sense for American diplomacy. Now, the Trump administration shut our office down, but 2 years in, the Biden administration has not restarted it. So you can't really say Republicans are bad on this and Democrats are good on this. It's a very mixed report card, to put it mildly. Now, would a piece of legislation help stabilize that? It's possible, because the Religious Freedom Office is authorized by a piece of legislation. So no president, no Secretary of State can close that office. Congress won't let them do it. Because ours was established by an executive order issued by Obama, that's vulnerable to being changed by any subsequent president. And that's what happened to us. I don't think you could get a bill through the United States Senate today authorizing an office like ours, just because of the partisan nature of our current Senate and Congress.
Let me reverse that first question, or the second question I asked. Are there nation states that you've seen do it well outside of the US?
Sure. I guess in the course of my 4 years, there were probably half a dozen countries who thought about doing what we did in their own unique way. And so the UK, Germany, Finland, Italy, Switzerland, yeah, mainly European countries. And I don't think any of them ever actually ended up pushing the button and starting it. And, one of the differences between our work and the Religious Freedom Office, the Religious Freedom Office now has almost 30 years, I guess more than 30 years of history. And a lot of countries have started analogous offices to our Religious Freedom Office. I think a lot of countries, particularly European countries, were stunned that America launched this religion analysis office before anybody else did. Like, we didn't think you guys were going to do this. There are some of the other countries that do religious freedom that do have cells of religious analysis like we did. Now, what the Trump folk did is they shut down our office and they took 4 of our billets, if you will, or full-time equivalent positions and moved them into it and made them a small team within the Religious Freedom Office. But there were 4 of them and there are 30 or 40 of the other folk. So that was sort of a wave, I think, an acknowledgement that what we did was good at some points. But to ask a staff of 4 to replicate what we did with 30 or 35 is not sufficient.
This week we sit at the convergence of my own spiritual tradition, the Passion Week. Passover is coming this weekend. We're within the month of Ramadan right now. How would you describe the team that you assembled and the various, from a pluralistic perspective, how would you describe the contributors to your team?
Well, it's weird. When I landed, I knew I would have 3 staffers to start. Okay. So when you talk about, well, how are you going to represent the religious pluralism of the world with 3 staffers? And it's like, good luck, pal. You know, there's no way you can sort that doesn't scream. You've got huge gaps in your understanding. Now, the good news is we eventually built out to 35 sort of through ingenious HR advice we got from a woman I hired after she did our onboarding. I knew if everybody looked like me and everybody was trained the way I was trained, we would be dead on arrival. It's just, I knew the thin slice of global Christianity that I knew. Now, to say the United States Department of State's only going to be experts on global Christianity, again, would have been a non-starter. So we were committed to diversity. Now, what you are up against, I can't ask anybody when I hire them. You know, I'm down 3 Presbyterians. Can you help me fill those slots? You know, I can't ask. But at the same time, I can ask people, what is your experience? Tell me, what religious communities do you understand? Who have you lived with, lived among? Where have you studied? Where have you lived? What's your linguistic background? If you look at the top 5 people, I got to hire one of those, and the other 3 were people I inherited. But nevertheless, among the top 5, we had 2 Jews, 2 Muslims, and 1 Christian. And I thought, at least on the face of it, that sent a decent signal that we weren't all old white males who'd studied Christian theology. We had 1 like that. That was me, right? But 1 was enough. Now, I had a number of people who did look like me on paper who came and said, hire me. And I was like, well, sorry, but no, because you don't have the experience I need around the world. And what you know, I already know. So you're not adding to the team. I think where we struggled was on the gender side, because of those 5, my chief of staff, who was Jewish, and then we had 2 male Muslims, 1 male Jew, and me. But in the leadership, the staff leadership, we had 3 or 4 teams, and they were all headed by women. So we had a regional advisors team that was headed by a foreign service officer. We had a public diplomacy team that was led by a foreign service officer. And we had a functional team looking at functional issues. And we had another woman lead there. So we ended up staff-wise about 50-50 male, female by the end of the day. So I think I would defend. Now, again, we never had an official tally of how many Muslims, how many Jews, how many Christians, and what flavor of each. But if you were to do the math on that, I think we did well. And the other part of it is I hired a number of staffers who never expressed a particular religious or theological affiliation, nor did I ever ask them what it was. So we had secular folk, we had devout folk, we had people who were, if that's a continuum, we were all across that continuum. And we tried very, very hard not to send uniform teams when we would send teams out. Were we perfect? No, we were not perfect, but we did try to model a form of inclusivity. Well, the other piece, the other curveball is you had to have a security clearance to come work for me. So if you look at, if there are 8 billion people on the planet, probably 80 billion forms of religiosity, however you want to define that, and you've got 35 people to choose from, and those 35 all have to have security clearances, the set of people I could hire was incredibly narrow. Now, there were a couple of times, there were people I desperately wanted who I said, look, I'm willing to wait the 8 or 9 months it's going to take you to get a security clearance. But that was the exception. That was not the rule. So we for all the constraints we had on who we could hire and how we could hire them, I think I would defend our composition. It wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I would defend.
I do want to ask the education question in terms of where else would it be helpful to have this kind of education? Places like Fletcher, other venues, but so I want to come back to that question. I'm dying to get to we discussed just prior in your interview with Mr. McCurry, you described 3 places where it was going well, or you saw some inroads. Cuba was one of them, Ethiopia was another, and then Ukraine. Got into Ukraine. I'm dying to hear about the other 2. So if you want to hear about the Ukraine one, I encourage you to go out on YouTube and watch that particular interview. But would you be willing to share the rest of those?
Yeah, so let me run Ethiopia, the Cuba. One of the things I had to do, the White House had issued a strategy on integrating religious leader and religious community engagement into U.S. foreign policy. And that was written before I arrived. And White Houses do this. There's a strategy paper for, like, how to open your water bottles, and don't spill, and just all kinds of protocols, which are wonderful. But anybody can write a great statement or great paper about how we should behave or act. It's quite another thing to implement it. So I got this literally like the second week I arrived. And it was like, who wrote this? Where'd this come from? And it came from the White House, and they were like, you're now the owner of this document, make it so. So the first thing it called for were 3 country studies. Now, at this point, I have 2 staffers. They're like, go do it. I said, well, how am I going to pay for this? Oh, go do it. And so I'm stunned that so the first meeting we had to pick the 3 country study locations, I'd left a meeting of like 30 other people in the bureaucracy, not the State Department, beyond. I left with a list literally of 45 countries on my legal pad. And I thought, this is not working, But we did. Ethiopia was the first one we eventually all agreed on. And Ethiopia is just an astonishing place. Any way you slice it. I mean, historically, economically, its current status, the African Union is based there. At that point, Ethiopia had become a Christian Muslim on par nation, which makes it very, very unique country. In fact, that was so explosive because historically a lot of Ethiopians think of themselves as a Christian, an Orthodox Christian nation, right? They stopped doing national polls because the notion that they might be on par, or that maybe the Muslim community was bigger than the Christian community, was so politically volatile. They did what any thinking semi-authoritarian government would do. They suspended the polling so that we don't have any census data now. But also then within the Christian world, a couple of things were happening. The biggest dynamic that we only began to see when I first arrived was the rise of various forms of evangelical Christianity. And historically, people have looked through the lens of Islam and Christianity, but Orthodox Christianity to understand the religious dynamics there. And nobody was really paying attention politically. Now, Prime Minister Abe is, in fact, a very specific kind of Christian. He's from a prosperity gospel background, which is a form of Pentecostalism that has been sweeping Africa for decades. And so the political dynamic there is much more complex religiously because they have a leader who's neither Muslim nor Orthodox Christian. When we went in, there had been sort of an echo of the Arab Spring in Ethiopia, where in a group of mosques in Addis and in other places, one Friday after Friday prayers, there were maybe a few thousand peaceful protesters from these mosques protesting for rights that are guaranteed in their constitution, but have never actually been honored and practiced. And the government was terrified as to why that happened. They actually invited us to come and help them understand those dynamics. And so what we saw in our 2 weeks there, the government had done what any good authoritarian government would do when they saw religious people protesting peacefully in the street. They arrested the leaders and they put them in jail and threw away the key. And all that did was feed more anxiety and anger, not only in the particular mosques where the protesters had come from, but in the country at large. People were saying, if it could happen to them, it could happen to us. And ultimately, I argued to the federal minister that I reported out to at the end of our investigation, you're exacerbating this trouble yourself, because you're not living into the legal rights inscribed in your constitution, you're trampling them. And the world sees that, and certainly Ethiopians see that. Now that's the government that got voted out eventually several years later. Now we fast forward, the government, our government recently affirmed that there were war crimes committed by all sides in this sort of three-way civil war in Ethiopia. And there's a fragile peace that's holding for the moment, but finding a way to adjudicate the war crimes that were committed there in a transparent and fair way that takes into account the dizzying ethnicity of Ethiopia and the more complicated religious dynamics is going to be extremely difficult to do. But I would argue for our government to understand the dynamics there, whether they are going to be successful or they fail, we have to be attuned to the conversation between the various religious constituencies there as they go through this process of trying to do some kind of reconciliation process. Now, we're in no position to dictate those terms, but we ignore those dynamics at our peril and at their peril. And so we find ourselves now, and so one of the main things we did for the embassy was to help them build what we call a religious landscape. Any American embassy in any country understands the political landscape. They know all the political parties. They try to maintain, to the extent possible, relationships with all of the political parties. They meet the people, they hear their wants, they hear their successes, we hear their failures. But when it comes to religion, there's no systematic accounting or building of relationships. And that's part of what we routinely did when we go to embassies. We'd help them build relationships, because once conflict starts, you can't build deep relationships when people are fighting with each other. You can't have any influence when bullets are flying and people are at each other's throats. We know that politically, but we've never known that religiously. And so part of what we tried to do there was help them in the embassy at Addis identify, from the largest to the smallest religious groups, who are their leaders, how do you listen to the grassroots, and then we modeled how you engage those folks. And we essentially left that portfolio with them and said, we'll continue to consult with you if you want our consultation. We were then trying not to manage from Washington, D.C. We're trying to equip embassies and consulates to do that kind of work themselves, because they're the ones who are on the front line of American diplomacy. And I think Addis in Ethiopia was one of our crown jewels there, the work and report we gave them. Now, does that knowledge still exist 9 years later in that embassy? I doubt it, because there's nobody been curating it for this time. And so I don't know that our embassy there is prepared to be an active mitigating presence in this fragile moment when they have a ceasefire, they have a fragile agreement, but there's no path to how do they live into that, and how do they try to rebuild the country.
Yeah, my time in the Horn of Africa, the Belt and Road initiatives were heavy in the atmosphere there in Addis. Yeah. Now you take those complexities and layer over some of those geopolitical realities.
One of the things, the Belt and Road is the Chinese government's sort of, we were driving by one of the absolutely, I don't know what the right adjective here would be, the juxtaposition of extraordinary wealth and absolutely grinding poverty back to back in Addis, but other places in Ethiopia was really, just, you couldn't overlook it. But I remember the Chinese government was building a sort of a metro rail. I think it was either, it might have been a subway or it was a mass transit system. And they went in and bulldozed the ghetto. I mean, just bulldozers showed up one day, boom. And it was just appalling to see how the Chinese, now I assume they had the government's position to do that. But if you were living in that particular space, it was too bad. You just had to take what you could and go. That can't leave a good impression on the citizens of Ethiopia who are having their property destroyed and taken away. But that was one of the earliest signs I saw of how the Chinese do these kinds of projects, particularly in Africa, in an absolutely terrifying way.
I don't want to leave Cuba on the table.
Oh,
do you have a quick 30-second?
Well, Cuba, I was one of the first diplomats who got to go to Cuba when, I guess it was in December of 2015, when President Obama normalized diplomatic relations by executive order. He couldn't lift the embargo. We have an economic embargo that will take an act of Congress to lift that, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. And he stunned the world. That was a real surprise. The Vatican had played a role in mitigating or bridging the conversation between the Cuban government and the American government. And so our office ran a White House meeting for any faith-based development or humanitarian organization who wanted to learn what the new regulations would allow them to do. And they did about a series of 5 of these, and ours was the largest. We drew a bigger crowd to the White House, a big, small, and medium-sized religious relief organizations so they could learn the rules. And because of that, the White House saw that the religious dynamic in Cuba was incredibly large because of the Vatican's work and because of the eagerness they saw among American development religiously affiliated organizations. So in their liberality, the Cuban government gave me 36 hours on the ground in Cuba to meet. I probably met with 100 different people in that 36 hours, which was kind of insane. But what we saw there was, the Cuban government had liberalized to a degree with respect to expanding religious communities' ability to worship as they saw fit, and had for the past 3 or 4 years. Secondly, all the religious groups were happy that Obama had reestablished diplomatic relations. As one person told me, he said, everybody in Cuba has a cousin in the United States. They look to America, deep cultural ties there. So anything that allowed more people to travel and more money, more remittances to be sent from the US back to Cuba was a good thing. And they all universally said that we should lift the economic embargo. So they were very eager on the ground among the array of religious communities we saw there for deeper ties. Now that, as you know, it's taken a turn for the worse. And we can go down that rabbit hole if you want to. But that brief opening, it was really astonishing to see how the diverse religious landscape of Cuba really did embrace the new American policy there.
Wonderful. The education piece, where else should this be happening? This kind of religion and geopolitics.
Well, obviously I'm biased.
Yeah.
This is what I've been doing for a long time. I taught in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, and even there, you would think at a Jesuit university, to be a diplomat and to get your training on religious dynamics should be easy. It wasn't horrible. It wasn't hard, but it was clunky. In my view, a well-rounded diplomat has a liberal arts education as a base. You need to be conversant across a number of academic disciplines to be able to carry a conversation and to be able to look with educated eyes at what's going on in different parts of the world. You just got to have that. But I don't think, either on the religious studies side, I think a lot of religious studies professors haven't thought about, do I have any professional duty to train students who might someday make good diplomats? It's just not part of the calculus. By the same token, schools of foreign service are like, yeah, if religion's your thing, go somewhere, find a course, yeah, take it. But I don't know that it's integrated, and I'm happy to be corrected here. It's it's not integrated into the curriculum very well in my experience. Now, I zigged and zagged between the Divinity School at Harvard and the Kennedy School and then back to the Divinity School. So I kind of had to build my own program. It wasn't because Harvard had a clear path with hundreds of students. Well, now there are a lot of students who've done versions of what I did back in the last millennium. But again, the institutions haven't always been helpful. There's not a joint degree between, like a master's in theological studies and a master's in public policy. And that's my experience. You, the student, have to be the driver. You have to be the one to navigate the wickets. Administrations and curriculum committees tend not to look at religion and say, oh, it needs to include diplomacy, or, oh, diplomacy needs to include a religion option. I wish it were different, but.
There's hope. I know locally, I've experienced some. I'm glad to be here as a military fellow. I don't know that that's the norm here within Fletcher. I did want to ask this question, and I want to make sure we have time for questions. What do we want? About 20, 30 minutes or so? Okay. I'll see if I can wrap these two together. With respect to national security prioritization, what types of religious engagements for the future had you seen during that time in the out years? What were you hopeful for at the Religion and Global Affairs Office?
So I would want to open the lens up beyond security, because as I tell a story in the book, that in the Obama era, there was an attempt to securitize religion, and that was under the Countering Violent Extremism. And in that thread goes back to the global war on terror back in the Bush era, where the successive administrations looked at the Muslim world, capital T, capital M, and you see, if you read the counterinsurgency doctrine, for instance, there are these trees of influence, and they all go back to this massive stem where all Muslims go back to this radical tree trunk. And you just look at that and say, that ain't going to work, because it's false. It's not true.
That dog won't hunt.
Yeah.
Is that what they say?
So no, what we argued for is you have to understand lived religion in specific context. And in a sense, you have to throw away your grand theories about a religion or religions, plural. And so we fought against this countering violent extremism. And I go to some length talking about how that's hard to do when you're the religion people, and yet somebody's trying to hijack religion for security ends, and yet they turn to us and say, won't you join the party? And we're like, actually, no, we won't. But I think that intellectual security, military, doctrinal trajectory is dead. I don't think, now there are still people who talk about it, but it doesn't have the energy and money behind it. And I think on the other hand too, religious freedom is great. We need to promote it. We need to identify when religious freedom violations occur, but that doesn't exhaust the ways that religious action, behavior, belief generates politically interesting data and behavior. There's a lot more of that beyond the religious freedom frame that needs to be assessed and analyzed and understood on the part of American diplomats. So it's very fragile right now, frankly. It's not clear where the American foreign policy apparatus writ large is going to go with respect to religion. Institutionally, we're back about where we were at the beginning of the Iraq War in the early Bush administration, in terms of the actual number of well-trained people doing good things around the world. Our capacity is degraded. And so it's a very fragile time right now.
I want to open it up to questions here. Just to dovetail off of that before we do, how would you engage religious leaders back then or key stakeholders without it landing or an awareness that they sensed that this was a bald-faced kind of instrumentalizing the faith, as it were? in changing priorities, across administrations?
Well, this obviously is a danger. Anytime any government begins to talk to religious communities, there's always a possibility that there's a subterranean hidden agenda at work, or that there's an overt coercive agenda at work. And I don't want to essentialize religious leaders here, but in my experiences, their radar goes off. If they think you're very into manipulating them into doing something they don't want to do, they speak loudly. So how do you combat that? One is you have to be very clear about both your ends and your means you want to engage. And so what does that translate into? Well, I think, first of all, you have to say, I'm here, and this is the policy we want to talk about. Now, the policy could be fully formed, and it's like, we want you to do a conference, or we want to co-sponsor something with you. It could be in a nascent stage where we see you're throwing thousands of your Muslim folk into prison. We want to talk about how we might be able to change that, but we're not here because we don't have any ideas, but we want to have a conversation to see if we might partner together. Or it could be half-baked. We got a half an idea here. We want to partner with you. It can be in an emergency. There were times when some of our staff went and gave a démarche to an embassy saying, stop doing what you're doing. We're watching you and we don't like it. So you have a variety of diplomatic tools available. I think you need to be clear and transparent. And at the end of the day, you also have to be able to take no for an answer. Now, I am by nature a stubborn human being. I grew up in a family where no meant try again. No was not an absolute truth. No meant keep working. I've got this sort of Black Irish temperament, but I had to be very clear, and we had to be very clear when we would pitch ideas or have conversations, and people would say, all right, give us time, we'll get back to you. And you have to give them the time they want. And then when they come back to you and say, actually, no, we can't do that. And sometimes it was just no with no reasons attached. Now, there were a couple of times I got a no and I asked some questions, but I made it very clear this was to help me do better next time, not because I've got some kind of coercive method to use. Now, to be honest, not all diplomats take that view. A lot of diplomats say, okay, I'm going to come back and hammer you when I get an opportunity. We had to learn to accept no for an answer, and then continue to have good relations with those communities, because another topic might come up at another time. So there's no perfect antidote to instrumentalization. When two people sit down and talk over coffee, there's always the human possibility you're going to manipulate me to your own ends, ignoring who I am in my own self. That's always a human possibility. So I think you have to be clear about what you want. You have to be willing to accept no, and you have to be clear about your motives, but also the means at which you're going to deploy interacting with people.
Wonderful, thank you. I do want to open it up. I have a question I'm going to ask, maybe it's filtered in there depending on when we have a spot, about some of the chaplain work, but I want to open it to the floor for questions. Somebody have a question? Yeah, Allie or? Okay.
But hi, I'm Allie. I'm a second year master's student here. First, thank you so much for coming here to talk to us. I was wondering if you mentioned how important it was for your office to be diverse. Did you ever encounter either other religious leaders or counterparts abroad that felt like you were coming at them and didn't really understand their particular religious context, and therefore that was a barrier to them wanting to work with you?
Are we picking up the question? Was the audio?
Yeah, you can maybe just repeat the questions briefly.
Okay, and I apologize because I was paying attention to that.
That's okay.
Diversity, I know it was related to diversity. And religion. It's a polite conversation. Okay. Okay.
Well, certainly, I mean, if you Google me, I come up Christian theologian. I've been a Christian clergy. I've taught at a Christian seminary. And so I had more than a little anxiety about what happens to me when I show up in a community that is not related to my own. But what I discovered was, almost without exception, other religious communities beyond mine were happy that I had staffers who were related to them. And they knew that. And I often traveled to show that, the detail I went. But secondly, they were able to say, we get you're not one of us, but we're so happy that there's an office dedicated to understanding other religious communities. It is religiously diverse itself. And no one ever looked at me and said, look, you're a stupid Christian, I'm not going to talk to you. Now, I can't read minds as much as I might want to do that. I never got that overtly back from them. In fact, they were happy to finally have a person, a diplomat coming from Washington, who was there to understand their community better. And we had kind of a model. You show up, you signal respect, you thank them for the work they have done. So we researched the people before we got there, so we could say, we understand you do a lot of relief work in this part of the world, or you run schools in your community, and that was genuine. I genuinely thank them for what they do. And ultimately, when you have these conversations, what you're looking for is to hear, what is the view from your religious community about this political issue that's going on? Educate me so I can educate my peers back in Washington, D.C. Anybody can be the conveyor of that. It doesn't, except if a really hardcore anti-religious secular person is carrying the message. That's been the stereotype historically of the U.S. State Department, whether that's fair or not. So really, I can't think, I got a welcome usually in these new communities, and it didn't really matter which team I was playing for theologically, as long as I signaled respect and interest, and to say, I'm here to be a conveyor of your message. And, now in certain parts of the world, to get to that deeper conversation, you had to wade through, well, you guys invaded Iraq. You guys always support Israel and you never support Palestine. Now, some diplomats feel the need to argue and adjudicate all of those complaints. And if I did that, there would be no hour left to have the conversation. So I would say things like, I take your point. Or in the case of the Iraq war, opposing the war in Iraq was one of the first public things I did as a professor in Washington, D.C. And that stunned a lot of people when I would say, I agree with you. Our invasion of Iraq was a disaster. It hurt your country. It hurt our country. And then after you got through that list of complaints, you could have the real conversation I was after. Tell me your point of view for the issue at hand. So that's kind of a long, winding answer.
Question, Jason, and then we'll go over here.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for coming in today. My name is Jason Thielen. I'm a one-year student studying a Master's of Law. I wanted to return back to your discussion around the landscapes that you put together and the country studies specifically. You mentioned coming away from a meeting and having a list of 45 countries to focus on. I find that the State Department of Diplomacy focuses on countries specifically. My question for you is, when you were doing country studies, when you were engaged on a country-to-country focus, to what extent did region come into play? And how much were regional components considered, discussed, brought into anything you did in the State Department? And then second part of the question is, if you're writing the legislation, you're writing the executive order, you're reestablishing your office going forward, how do you implement a regional focus into that kind of an office? Well,
the regional question, in a sense, is easily answered. The State Department carves the world into six regional bureaus. Now, anytime you carve a globe into 6 regions, there are going to be some borders you look at and you say, I don't get this. But it's a fact. It's like walking into a classroom and you have a professor standing up the front saying, I'm the one that's going to be doing the grading today or this semester. As bizarre as some of those lines were, I was in no position to ever influence the redrawing of those lines. And I had a clock ticking on me. So what we did is I went to each, there's an assistant secretary of state for each of the 6 regional bureaus. I had an advisor for each of the 6 regions. So I took them to meet with their assistant secretary and I said, show us your strategy, show us your priority issues, show us your priority countries. We will come back to you with a plan to show you how I can make you successful in your own strategic goals by using the tools we will help give you. So I knew if you go around the regionals, you'll just be a shiny bauble office that gets nothing done. So we integrated ourselves into the existing regional structure. Now, that also helped us sort, again, with 30, 35 people, and 200 plus or minus nation states around the world, we couldn't do stuff in all of those. We had to be able to say no more often than we say yes in terms of countries. And the third dynamic was, where was Secretary Kerry involved? So he was involved in Ukraine, he was involved in Cuba, he was involved in the Vatican. So we often aligned with his countries as well as what we were hearing from the regional assistant secretaries. So I knew, I mean, in a perfect world, if I were back, I would set up the same regional structure, and I would have each of those regional advisors pick 2 countries to work at the embassies, do the landscapes, leaving a little bit of bandwidth in case something blows up somewhere or something amazing happens that presents another opportunity, like Cuba. Cuba was not on anybody's radar screen, but we had the bandwidth to do that. So the regional lens is kind of built into the State Department itself.
Hi, my name is Lian Hin. Congrats for your new book.
Thank you.
First, you're a Walsh student. You said it's a really fragile time, and especially considering the policy implemented in regard to religion and policy and public policy. So I wonder if it is because of the level of threats that policymakers are perceiving. So in early 20s, when we had like a 9/11 attack, then people tend to think religions more seriously. And we are now in 2023, and maybe we have different threats, like let's say AI or other things, more than religion. So do you think those are possibility that policymakers or leaders didn't take religious into consideration?
So let me make sure, are you saying that people may be moving away from religion because of the current global dynamics, or they should be looking for different?
Or is an area of focus?
I mean, like we witness a lot of religiously motivated violence and attacks, and those seems to be less.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think every Secretary of State comes in with a list of his or her priorities. And maybe somewhere in like the 4th month, that sheet of paper gets torn up just by facts on the ground, as you said. One area where I think it's growing, and one area where they're not easy answers, but with the rise of global populism. Again, I don't want to essentialize here, but you often see as authoritarian leaders arise and on their way up, there are favored religious communities and there are disfavored religious communities. And they stomp on people and embrace people on their way up. It's happening in our own country. We've seen that, which makes it even more complicated about how you get to be a State Department when maybe your own political leaders are doing the kind of things you're seeing around the world. There's no magic easy formula for engaging a country that has an authoritarian leader that is doing this, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's Islamophobia. It's hard to know how to get them to turn that off or turn that down. But the fact that democracy is on its heels, it's receding in major parts of the world, I think part of our pro-democracy promotion has got to figure out how do we begin to push back on leaders and political parties that affirm them on this notion that it's politically advantageous for them to pick people to pick on religiously, and it's advantageous to pick people you're going to favor. And our own history, we are not innocent in this respect historically. And if you want to read a great book, read Anna Sue's book, Exporting Freedom. Is it Religious Freedom? Yeah. We read that, yes. And what Anna shows that in America's religious freedom policies going back centuries, we have been on the side of using religious freedom as a cover to promote and to actually undercut other religious communities that we don't respect. So we are by no means perfect on this in our own history. But I think that's the most disturbing trend I see, is that authoritarian right-wing populist leaders are turning to this persecution, but also then embrace simultaneously other groups. And that's not just a security issue. You know, Marines landing on your shores is not going to sort that. And so I think that's what's changed in the decade or so since I was there, is this notion of we don't have a lot of diplomatic wisdom. And it varies by context. You might be able to engage a government in Central Europe, but that doesn't mean you can engage a government, say, in South America or in other places. The dynamics can be radically different. So there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all model. But that's a great, you're absolutely right. The political implications of religion are not static. They vary, they ebb and they flow.
Over here in the middle. And then Kate.
Thank you so much for your absolutely united presentation and today. And I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Yuhen. This is my first semester here as a mod student, and I'm an international student from China. And I have a question. I think my country, China, obviously is playing more prominent role in the global governance. And there's a recent example, like the mediating the relationship between the Saudi Arabia and Iran. So I'm just wondering your perspective on that, and I would be liking to hear about your thoughts. Thanks so much.
Sure. Oh my goodness, how many hours do we have?
Point.
Right. I do think the Chinese, it shouldn't be a surprise that I mean, they now want to show up in parts of the world, new historical context to wield their influence. Certainly, one could argue America's, I have to parse this carefully. Let me see. America's influence is not on the uptick, certainly in the Gulf area, given our vexed relationship with Iran. There are no active peace negotiations going on that we're part of in Israel, Palestine. There are diplomatic opportunities there for a superpower like China to engage and intervene. We shouldn't be surprised. I think the real question is what's the substance of that engagement going to look like? What is that actually going to do? And their increased engagement in Ukraine and engagement with Russia should not be a surprise. I mean, just sort of classic realist global power theory would suggest in a vacuum like that, superpowers are going to try to increase their influence. So from a theoretical standpoint, I don't think we should be surprised. Now, should we be troubled? Should we be asking the question, what are their purposes there? What are the tools they're going to use? To me, that is the more important set of questions. I think it's naive on any American's part to assume that we're shocked they're there. I think that's just naive beyond belief. But it's going to be in the nitty gritty of diplomacy in those both bilaterally and multilaterally to see. I don't think the current government in China is looking for military engagement around the world. I think the trip, Xi's trip recently to Russia was very, very interesting for what was not said as much as for what was said. There didn't seem to be a deep, open-ended commitment militarily to Russia's adventure there. So I think this is one of the great global, maybe the great global political question to be watching today. What are going to be the consequences for China's engagement there? And we're in no position to tell them to stay away. I mean, we have no ability to do that.
Regards to how the China's efforts in mediating the relation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So since they used to have less kind of conflicts due to their religions.
Well, I mean, I think everybody, I think concretely, it's what is the nuclear future of Iran in terms of developing nuclear weapons? And I'm not an expert on China, but I've not seen anything to indicate they're there to enhance Iran's nuclear capability. But it's also not clear to me they're there to take it away or help it go away. So at this point, I don't have an answer for that, but I think that's the question to watch, to see what will be their policy influence there. And I think The other, what are the 9 Gulf countries, give or take, I think they're all anxious about Iran and its nuclear capability. And the talk now of the Saudis wanting to acquire their own capacity looks like an updated version of superpower Eastern competition from an earlier generation. I don't think that's in anybody's best interest to see a nuclear armed Gulf at this point, but we could be on that.
Yeah, I think part of the question was just the religious nexus between those two countries, but
then we.
Yeah. In terms of it being at play with China coming in.
I am not aware. I mean, there's some people who say that many Muslim countries have muted their criticism of China with respect to the Uyghurs. You don't think of a strong response from some Muslim majority countries in criticizing China for the Uyghurs. Now it is interesting. China has two centers of thought in the government with respect to religion. They've got the SARA is its acronym that actually manages actual religious communities and keeps them. But in their humanities academic division, they have an extraordinarily trained group of scholars who are weighing this question of what is the role of religion in Chinese civil society. It seems to me diplomatically, and again, this is just my own opinion, we have missed opportunities between bilateral conversations between American scholars and American government officials, diplomats, and that group of intellectuals. I don't think it's clear how influential they really are now inside the party. But I'm not aware of a deeply informed Chinese foreign policy with respect to religious communities around the globe. It may exist. If it does, I'm not aware of it. So I would be interested if that dynamic appears in their diplomacy, but that's escaped my attention if it's there.
Either Kate or Ciara? Okay, question on Zoom.
Yeah. So this is from Carol W. The question is, can you comment from your very unique context on the potential for military chaplains who have been doing key leader engagements with the religious leaders for years during OIF/OEF to engage at a strategic versus tactical or operational level?
So can I augment that question a little bit? Because it does tie into one of the questions I wanted to ask. So OIF is Operation Iraqi Freedom. OEF is Operation Enduring Freedom, the campaign in Afghanistan. I would like to add on to that, back end of that, also places for training and what you've seen change. I read some of your notes in your book about the early nascent expressions of that and some of the challenges, difficulties, and then have you seen it change or grow? But to that question.
Based on my experience and my time there, I'm not a big advocate of engaging chaplains either at the strategic or tactical level. Now, there are exceptions. I met a handful, but they were the exceptions that prove the rule. If you look at the average graduate theological seminary training, the Master of Divinity degree, now we're talking about Christians, and our chaplaincy corps is overwhelmingly Christian and is moving more towards an evangelical majority, if not already there. The seminary where I taught for 13 years had no courses on, for the MDiv, the Master of Divinity level, on the role of chaplains in doing either strategic or tactical engagement with religious communities. It's not part of their portfolio. I do tell the story about where I met with the chiefs of all the chaplaincy corps who invited me over. And so historically, the chaplains have had this mission for the spiritual care of the fighting force, and they are non-combatants. A second mission was added by the Joint Chiefs that said they've got a second mission. If commanders in the field choose to use a chaplain, they can choose to use them in this community engagement role. The chaplain chiefs in 2015 told me our corps does not have the capacity to do that. They are not trained to do that, and we are basically terrified. And they didn't even control their own training. mean, the Navy, for instance, I think it was, the training of chaplains is done by the training and education department, not the chaplains themselves. So it's like asking people to, now this is highly potentially consequential work, particularly in combat areas. And I just think putting chaplains in that position to play that role of meeting with local religious leaders, and I'm not sure what, are they getting intelligence from those people that's actionable? These are people who are not trained to do this, and they are non-combatants, but they're being put in local context where they're basically indistinguishable from combat troops. So there are just 1,000 ways you look at this and you say it's not a good idea. The clincher for me is if you read C.J. Chiver's book, The Fighters, and I quote this just astonishing, wrenching paragraph where he says, both in Afghanistan and in Iraq, with a few exceptions, special forces he mentions, the fighters on the Western fighters in both Afghanistan and Iraq were at a distance, a cultural, linguistic, religious distance from the people they were occupying. And the counterinsurgency strategy that was about hearts and minds was not actually lived out in that sense. So I find this to be an incredibly bad idea to turn to these professional chaplains who do not have the training, who do not, now again, there are exceptions, but the exceptions don't mean that, that it's going to be a good thing. And it was up to the local commanders to make that decision. Do I use the chaplain? Do I not? And they, the heads of the chaplaincy corps at that point, were really very nervous because they don't get to say, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs,
Yeah.
we can't do that.
Yeah.
If they're told to do it, they have to make a way and find a way. They're doing that. But I don't think that's a good policy solution.
Are there places they could get that training, like the U.S. Institute for Peace across from the State Department, or is there any place for those who show a propensity to maybe be good at it? Is there a place to?
I would argue the capacity of USIP, and there's some nonprofits, their capacity to send 300,000 troops through over the course of a decade, it's not there.
I'm referring to the chaplains who are tasked to go do that thing. Hey, before you get tasked to go do that thing, go get some training. The 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 at a time. I don't know USIP's.
But yeah, but the capacity to train even the chaplains is not there.
Okay.
You're not going to get a graduate degree in religion in a can from any place.
Yeah.
This takes a long time.
Yeah. Tiara?
I know we have to wrap up, but I have a question that I think will be a good wrap up.
Okay.
At Divinity School, we talk a lot about the religion being silent. So religion and global affairs office, it's like, oh, that's for religion, as future diplomats or State Department, national security, et cetera. Okay, now hopefully one day RGA is back open and that's where all the religion stuff goes. So this desk, just put it to Shaun Casey and crew. I'm wondering kind of those who aren't going to be working in a capacity that says religion directly, how can we bring as students going into these career paths, religious literacy, ensuring that we don't fall into these tropes of, for example, the Saudi-Iran of like, oh, it's a Shia-Sunni conflict.
Right.
And how did China mediate and breaking through those stereotypes of that, or it's a religious conflict because we know it's not just about religion. Can you talk about that as some pro tips?
Well, our argument was the reason we needed to train embassies to have this capacity and to do this work was to put us out of business. So just as, the analogy I drew was the human rights. You think about Jimmy Carter back in the late 70s said, I'm going to integrate human rights into the mainstream of American diplomacy. And the State Department screamed basically over our dead bodies. And now human rights is integrated at the embassy level. So what I argued was if understanding religious dynamics and engaging religious communities and actors was going to be ingrained into the DNA it's because the Foreign Service Officer Corps was trained in how to do this on an ongoing basis. That's the answer. I didn't want to be a shiny bauble office, which is where all the religious people went. That actually is what the Religious Freedom Office has played over the years, and is now playing more than they were back in the Obama era. So it has to be part of the formal training, the ongoing training of Foreign Service officers, because you don't just get your Foreign Service badge and stop, but you continue to take courses both back in the States at the embassy and in regional training centers. And I would give us just a C-, maybe D+ for our we had 3 missions. One was to advise Carrie. The second one was to train embassies to do the work. And the third was to be the walk-up window for any external actor who wanted to partner with us. And it's that second one, which in terms of the long arc of the work is the most important. We barely got started on that. That's a great question.
Well, our time is gone. I do want to give Dr. Casey a hand. Thank you